Welcome to Currently, a weekly news roundup featuring conversations about the top local stories from the past 7 days, from the journalists who are covering them. I'm your host, Christal Frost. Now, this podcast was recorded at 5:30 p.m. on Thursday, February 13th, so things may have changed by the time you're watching or listening. Currently is made possible by underwriting from our generous lead supporter, Golden Fowler Home Furnishings, located on South Garfield Avenue in Traverse City. Home fashion, elevated. Support also comes from West Shore Bank. When you choose West Shore Bank, you're not just choosing a bank, you're choosing a partner committed to the well-being of our community. Visit them today on 8th Street or at westshorebank.com. And the Coin Slot Arcade Bar in Traverse City. It's a chill hangout boasting a full bar of 200-plus rotating cans, drafts, shooters, and pinball machines in a low-key setting. Joining me in the studio today, as always, head writer of the Traverse City Ticker, Ms. Beth Milligan.
Hello.
Hello. What's in your cup today?
I have kombucha from Oriana.
Right.
Which Oriana is one of my offices away from home downtown that I work at, along with the Coin Slot.
Do you have a home?
I just rotate between offices at different businesses. I love Oriana, though.
That's fantastic. Also joining us, we have a guest, if you haven't noticed. The fantastic, wonderful, magnificent, and always punctual Ed Ronco, news director for Interlochen Public Radio. Hi, Ed.
Hey, I don't know that I deserve all those adjectives, but I'll take them.
We did have a question. I just said you're punctual. I didn't actually fact check that.
Almost always.
Almost always?
Almost
Does
always.
that count?
Sure, we'll take that.
I sit at the
Fact
airport
checkers on
2
the
hours
website.
before the flight. I'm that guy.
You do?
I do. I bring
Actually,
a book.
2 hours?
I'd rather be bored for an hour or two than run through an airport. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm that guy.
probably the same way. Yeah.
I'm the one who's like the last one on the plane, making everyone wait for me. I'm so sorry. Not punctual at all.
Do you have something in your pancake boy mug?
I have a radio host's favorite, which is water.
Oh,
yes.
fantastic.
Professional.
All right,
Yeah.
well, I have my waning ambition in my mug today, so that's where we will go.
Let's try to fill that back up today.
And for all of you who are still with us, the Ticker is a free multimedia daily news, email, and website. It's available to anyone, everyone. It offers up the top of the minute, up to the minute news and community information. It has a lot of social media. Beth, I think you handle that.
I do handle the social media. Yes.
God bless you.
And I get right in there in the comment section. I answer
You
questions
do.
for people. I correct misinformation. I'm very hands-on.
Yes, you are. Be sure to subscribe at traverseticker.com. And Interlochen Public Radio is a listener-supported public radio station that delivers the latest news and in-depth reporting nationally, statewide, and regionally. Don't miss IPR's variety of local podcasts, including the Up North Lowdown, which I love. And
Thank
it
you.
has the best name. Kind of mad for you coming up with that name. That's a really good name.
That's nice. Thank you.
You can find it and all of the other Interlochen Public Radio productions wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you both for being with us today.
Yeah,
Lots of news this week. It's like it never stops.
it doesn't,
It's-
sadly.
Yes.
It's
My
just a matter of trying to
alerts
keep up.
keep, yes.
When you hear people say, slow news day, does that make you giggle? Because you're like, no, it's never.
If they're outside the newsroom, I do sort of chuckle to myself. If they're inside the newsroom, I say, stop, don't say that.
Something will
Don't tempt
happen.
fate.
Well, we're going to get right into all the news. And as we mentioned on last week's show, we often feel the effects of national news here locally. It seems like that's how it happens. So that's where I wanted to start this week with a story that the IPR team is thinking about that is related to how public broadcasting gets its funding and, what any sort of federal cuts might mean for local stations like Interlochen Public Radio. But I feel like before we dive into that, I think we need to talk about the First Amendment.
It's been in the news a little bit this week.
A little bit of a history lesson. It's a foundational amendment. It's the First Amendment. So I think that means it's important, right? It protects the freedom of speech, religion, press, and assembly. And I've always looked at it as the birthplace for journalism in our country. And independent journalism allows people of this country to be aware of what is happening in our government. And that is obviously essential to what it means to be an American. So I think it's fair to say it was pretty unnerving to see what unfolded this week when there were members of the Associated Press that were literally barred from attending the president's signing of a new executive order. And the reasons behind this were because they did not refer to the renamed Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. And I want to emphasize this. It wasn't like the president was saying, you can't come to my, Tupperware party. It was like, you can't come to this very important legislative event. So, Beth, if you don't mind starting with this, I mean, what does it mean from the lens of journalism to be arbitrarily removed from covering these not only important legislative events, but the public has a right to know? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it's good to clarify, first of all, why the Associated Press was referring to it as the Gulf of Mexico and not the Gulf of America. Because there's, another order that changed, for example, McKinley and Denali, and they have acknowledged that because that's within the complete geographic confines of the United States. The Gulf of Mexico is still being referred to as the Gulf of Mexico by the country of Mexico. They have not recognized that change. So there's international disputes over that name. And I think for people who don't know, the Associated Press, and Ed could certainly, attest to this too, is kind of the gold standard of journalism in America. I mean, when we're working on election night, if the Associated Press calls a race, like that's often the one that we're looking to. They're known for being even-handed, for being neutral. A lot of the wire stories that even like the Record Eagle or our local press pick up are coming from the Associated Press. This is a very important institutional, news outlet in the United States. And so I think, they're very careful about what they decide to call things. And they have like what's called an AP style book, which is what us journalists often use to, like, how do we capitalize something? How do we use something? So the First Amendment issue here is important because it's not just why the Associated Press decided to do something or not. It's the government sort of imposing an ideological standpoint on a journalism outlet and saying your access is contingent on you complying with how we think you should be reporting the news. That is a clear line in the sand that we have always tried to adhere to. That's the separation there that's been really important for journalism. So that is worrying to me as a journalist to see that kind of imposition. The White House later said it's a privilege to cover things in the Oval Office, and they will make decisions about who and who can't be in there. I would also just say it's a privilege to serve in the Oval Office. It's a federally funded building. The people elected the president to be there and pay his salary, and the ability for the press to access that with equality and be able to cover important news, not just from an ideological standpoint, which becomes government propaganda. We see that in other countries. We try not to have that here. But to be able to maintain that neutrality and independence is really important for journalists. And a little troubling to me also to see that this week.
Did you have anything you wanted to add about?
No, I agree, obviously, and I think that it felt to me like such an arbitrary and unnecessary fight to have with the Associated Press. This is an organization that has, for decades and decades, kept itself out of partisan arguments, kept itself out of opinion journalism, and the kinds of things that could alienate itself from a governmental administration. Its job is to just show up, tell you what's happening, and go on. And so it just seems unnecessary to me, in addition to being, as Beth said, troubling and a real concern for the way we treat the press in our country.
Yeah. So, knowing sort of that first foundational layer, I think it's important then to add a layer and discuss how, the recent threats to defund public broadcasting are also impacting the way that people may be able to get their news in the future. So if you could give us some context, Ed, what is public broadcasting and why does it matter?
President Johnson in the 60s signed the public
Lyndon
B,
Okay.
not Andrew.
A boy.
Lyndon. In the 1960s, signed the Public Broadcasting Act, and its purpose was to make sure that everybody in America had access to quality information and education. It started with public television. Public radio came along. NPR, as we know it, came along in the 70s. And the idea is pretty simple. The government puts forward some money to support the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And that organization, which is not a government agency, it is separate, but funded by an appropriation from Congress, gives money to hundreds of stations all around the country. They then buy programs from places like NPR and American Public Media, which does a show called Marketplace that's very popular, or PRX, which does a show called This American Life that a lot of people listen to. And it's up to the local stations to decide what's best for their local audiences, purchase it, play it, and use some of that money to bring you local news, to bring you local information, to have your neighbor come on the air and spin some music for you. It's a real variety out there in public radio. We conflate NPR with public radio. NPR is a national network that covers national news. Public radio is so much deeper and richer than that. And the government funding part of it makes radio possible in places that couldn't otherwise support it. My first job in radio was in Sitka, Alaska, population 8,000. Could the people of Sitka fund their own radio station completely? No. They do a pretty good job getting most of the way there. But in comes this grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and makes sure that national, state, and local news can be heard in a place that is on an island, remote, with no roads going in or out, and has 8,000 people. And that's repeated all over the country.
So it's equity.
It's equity.
Yeah.
It's making sure that access exists for everybody who needs it to the local, rich, fact-checked, verified news, but also culture and connection to neighbors.
Wonderful way of saying that. Thank you so much for that, because, obviously that totally answers the question of why does it matter, and what if we were to see a cut in funding to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, what would that specifically mean for our local Interlochen Public Radio?
Yeah, Interlochen Public Radio has about 14% of its budget coming from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
So it's not the vast majority.
It is not. The vast majority of our support comes from individual listeners, and that's true at most public radio stations. In our case, it would be a hard pill to swallow. It would mean less ability for us to serve the public in the way we've been serving the public on the local level.
For sure.
And that's what really concerns me.
Yeah. I think anybody who's thinking about even their personal budget, if somebody just took 14% of that away, you would have to make sacrifices. So we see that that would play out with Interlochen Public Radio. And I wonder too, like when we think about all of this, we think about what just happened in the Oval Office. We think about now this, these new threats. It's not the first time that public broadcasting has been threatened. It's been threatened before. But we see these new threats to cut public broadcasting. And I wonder what this says on a deeper level about how this administration seems to regard public news sources in particular.
Public broadcasting.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think certainly they would tell you, and the argument we've heard a lot in public forums is that the American people shouldn't support something that they think is biased, that they think is against them. I would say that the funding they're talking about cutting is going to have the deepest impact on local news. And if you look at the local news that's produced by not just Interlochen Public Radio, but public radio stations across the country, it's what happened in City Hall.
Yeah.
It's what your kid's high school is doing for the spring musical and whether the football team made states. It is not broadsides from any agenda about politics. In fact, we are eager to have as many voices as possible on our air all the time. So I think, there's a disconnect between what the administration might think it's doing by cutting public broadcasting money versus what the actual impact will be.
And this is something I would say then, just to give a plug, I'm an IPR supporter and I would encourage, so many people to do it. And Ed and I are friends, and I think there's sometimes a perception that journalists are competitive or news outlets are competitive. And there's a little friendly competition sometimes of who can break a story. But, we have a great collaboration and a lot of journalists in Northern Michigan that are working together. In part because sometimes some administrations aren't as friendly to media and you really need to band together, and sometimes you have to legally fight back and sometimes you have to financially support each other or help each other with reporting. But, you and I talked about this last week. There are so many news deserts now in the country, and we really need places like IPR, hopefully the Ticker, but we have some other great outlets in Northern Michigan as well, just bringing, like Ed said, that it's not just the national headlines that you're getting on the major channels. It's what is happening at the school board meeting, what is happening with your neighbor's zoning, those kind of stories. And so that's what we try to do, but IPR does a fantastic job with that too.
I mean, that's really what this podcast is devoted to. It's local news, right? It matters to you. You want to know what's going on with your school board. You want to know what's going on with zoning. And we do have such powerful voices that are coming nationally, but we want to hear from everyone because that's what matters. So for listeners, for viewers right now, even those who may not, listen or consume public broadcasting, but they do understand the necessity for it. How can they make their voices heard? Like, what can we do as people to really resist this?
I think the most important thing to do first is to just get an understanding of the facts. At interlochenpublicradio.org, we have posted answers to some of the questions we've been receiving about what's going on with federal funding. So learn what's happening with IPR in particular. If you're not in Northern Michigan and IPR is not your station, call your local station. Ask, find out. They would be more than happy to talk to you about this. And then at that website too, interlochenpublicradio.org, we have advice for people who want to make their voice heard, whatever their opinion is, honestly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the first thing is get a sense of what's going on, talk to your local station, find out what they're thinking about as this possibility of a funding cut comes down. And then, it's a congressional appropriation that determines how much money public broadcasting gets in that form.
Well, good advice. And obviously, it's interlochenpublicradio.org.
Interlochenpublicradio.org.
Okay, thank you. I thought I knew that by heart. And I did it. Right. Coming up, we're going to talk summer concerts. Yes, summer is a real thing. And they're starting to trickle out, these announcements. Plus, 2 Northern Michigan school districts have improvement plans. And a question, is the Department of Natural Resources going broke? All of that ahead on Currently. So before we continue, I'd like to say a word or two about our lead underwriter for Currently, Golden Fowler Home Furnishings. So have you ever looked at your living room? I mean, like you glance over and you are transported to another time. You cannot help but be flooded with memories. Late nights spent rocking a teething baby, the way your teenage son never just sits on the furniture, he just sort of sprawls fully across the couch, or snuggling up in your chair with a sleeping dog, finally sleeping on your lap. How about just holding hands on the couch with your favorite person during a family movie night? These are the reasons we really care about our living room furniture. It's the living part that gets us. Golden Fowler Home Furnishings understands that. And that's why they recommend Smith Brothers Furniture out of Indiana. It's furniture for living. Furniture that will go above and beyond for 10 years or more. It's the furniture that will hold those memories. And you can find it at Golden Fowler Home Furnishings on Garfield Avenue in Traverse City. Home fashion elevated. All right, friends. So welcome back to Currently. Now, Beth, recently TCAPS announced some plans for some major and, I'm going to just say it, much needed improvements across the district. And your story yesterday unveiled a new $32 million bond proposal to improve Kingsley Schools. So these are 2 different, separate school districts or different proposals. Let's start with TCAPS. What kind of improvements are we talking about here?
Sure. So TCAPS already has an approved capital bond. So now they have the funding in place approved by voters to start tackling some of these major projects. Things will be coming down the pipeline in the future, like the reconstruction of Central Grade School.
Ooh.
Talked about since probably I went to Central Grade School.
It's been 40 years they've been talking about.
Not put an exact number on it, but it's been a little while. So that's coming. But what we have these kind of bundle of projects that were approved by TCAPS trustees on Monday. So nearly $10 million in bond projects, the 2 largest of which deal with Traverse City West High School and Traverse Heights. I did also go to TC West, and I'm very familiar with the traffic circulation at TC West, which is a challenge.
It is.
It's a challenge in that school. Right now, the internal, there's 2 lights to get into the high school. There's the road that it kind of goes through the internal circulation of the school, goes between the parking lots and the building. So you have a lot of conflicts with students crossing in front of cars. So one of the bond projects is going to take place over the next 2 summers, is going to be a nearly $4.5 million reconstruction of the entire traffic circulation of that high school. So we're taking one of the traffic lights out on North Long Lake Road, consolidating the entrance and exit to the Herkner Road light. redoing that pattern so that the road will go on the outside of the parking lots, moving the parking lots up next to the high school building.
Oh, that's huge.
Adding some new crosswalks, sidewalks, changing the athletic parking. So it's a major project. And there are also going to be some other things going on at TC West at the same time. They're doing some energy efficiency upgrades and redoing some of the restrooms at West. So in order to get all of that done, they felt it was a little too intense in one summer. They do try to do construction in the summer so that they're not disrupting students who are learning. But this will take 2. So we'll see part of this happen this coming summer and part in 2026.
How old does a school have to be before we stop calling it the new high school? 'Cause I've been calling it the new high school for about 40 years.
Yeah. And I think when they separated, there was a lot of people who, when they graduated from Central, which was just the high school, then they still think of it as the high school. It's just like the new mall and the old mall. Yeah. You'll just, it may never go away. So that's one of the projects. Right. The other project is at Travers Heights. So that school is getting 3 new classrooms. They're getting a new restroom between 2 existing classrooms, expanding the cafeteria, renovating the music room. What I think is interesting about Travers Heights is this is a school that has seen a remarkable turnaround in the last couple of years. Dr. John Van Wagner, who's a superintendent of TCAPS, was saying when he was hired in 2020, they were looking at closing that school.
Wow.
And we've seen TCAPS has had to close some of its schools. The population shifts, whether it's Blair, Interlochen, different schools have had to go through this. Travers Heights was struggling with its enrollment. And so just a few years ago, they had 179 students. They are now today at over 300 students. They've seen remarkable growth. And part of that is because there is an incredible staff there. Principal Brian Kay has brought a lot of energy to that building, a lot of commitment to the students. That surrounding neighborhood is one of the most affordable places still within the city of Traverse City to live, which is saying something. It's not easy to find housing in Traverse City, so that's bringing in families. We've also seen a lot of housing growth on Lafreniere Road nearby with new apartment complexes coming online. So all of those things have helped Traverse Heights, and so that's a school, again, just a few years ago, looking at closing it, and now it's getting some millions of dollars in renovations to help those students.
Yeah, that's great. Let's move over to Kingsley at this point, because now Kingsley is looking at some improvements, but they have a long way to go to get there, right?
Yes.
Starting with a ballot proposal, $32 million ballot proposal. And I know how difficult it is to even consider putting any sort of funding to the voters if you don't already maybe think that it's going to have some support. So why don't we start there? This is going to go to the voters in May. $32 million is a big chunk of change. What does it include, and what does the community already think of that?
Sure. So the total request is 39.2. No, it's okay. 39.2 million. So almost 40. And this is an interesting road for Kingsley because they put a very similar request, at least funding amount wise, to the voters in 2019, and it failed badly. It was defeated by basically a 3-1 margin. And that at the time, was a big ask. It would have brought the district's mill rate from 2.43 mils up to 7. Which is a very significant tax rate, especially for a rural area with a smaller school district. That's a big ask for families. Also, the year that bond proposal came out, the district had multiple controversies. There was a principal who was arrested. They had lost some students to suicide. It was a really difficult year for that school district, and that proposal just tanked at the ballot. However, the reality is that there are more and more families moving to Kingsley. They are really jam-packed space-wise in their elementary and middle school. They also have a new superintendent, so they've done a lot to try to re-engage families, re-engage the community. This bond proposal, they went and looked back at why the previous one failed. They pared back some of the projects. Instead of proposing, for example, to build a brand new middle school, they're proposing to put a middle school addition onto the existing high school. And then use the existing middle school and the elementary school to house, to split into an upper and lower elementary school. They're also looking at some community facilities, like a fitness center that would be not only available to students, but to the public to use, which was something they heard in feedback sessions. So I think they're hoping this time around, instead of just going right back to voters in 2019, they kind of took some time to lick their wounds a little bit and to think about, what does the community need? What might be able to get support for? So like you said, that's going to be on the ballot in May. what they're asking in the meantime, because they know that there might be questions. How is this different than before?
Right.
What is this going to look like for my taxes? They're going to hold a series of informational sessions. So if folks want to check those out, those are going to be happening on February 19th, March 4th, and March 19th, all at 6 o'clock at Kingsley High School. And you can go to traversticker.com if you want to find this information again, if you don't have something to write it down with right now. But, when I talked to Josh Rothwell, the new superintendent, he just said what he really wants is just get informed, like we were talking about for this whole show.
Right.
Just learn the facts, as Ed was saying earlier. Ask us the questions. And then at least when you go into the ballot box, we feel comfortable, you feel comfortable that you made an educated decision.
Mm-hmm.
But they're wanting to put that information out there so people can know what's in the proposal.
Yeah, it sounds like they did take a little time and regroup, and yet improvements are still needed, right? So just because something fails before doesn't mean that it's the problems are going to go away.
And capital bonds are, we can get into a whole separate discussion on education funding in this country,
I know
but
it's your favorite thing to talk about.
But I think most people are at least familiar enough with their school systems to know that capital bonds are a major way that we get improvements to the schools. And for a district like Kingsley, even just having security in the vestibules, things that we need in a modern time.
Absolutely. We're going to move on to a story that your team covered yesterday, Ed, and I thought this was such a great story. You covered a story, actually Ellie Katz covered a story about the funding model for the DNR, and the DNR is the state's Department of Natural Resources. And I think it's pretty fair to say that funding is an issue right now. Ellie Katz was able to sit down with a former DNR wildlife director who explained why he thinks the funding model is failing and why it seems to be failing. And as I understand it, the DNR gets around 2/3 of its conservation budget directly from hunting and fishing license fees. But you don't have a lot of people hunting and fishing anymore. And yet the DNR is broadening the services they're providing, right?
Right. Yes. This is a funding model called the North American model. So it's not just Michigan's plan. This is something a lot of states use to fund their specifically fish and wildlife efforts
Mm-hmm.
through whatever their analog agency is, Department of Natural Resources or whatever it's called in
Right.
whatever state, right? Yes. And the money for it, about 2/3 of it, comes from when you go and you buy your hunting license or you buy your fishing license. That money is what funds those efforts. And that worked for a long time. DNR's scope of kinds of things it was managing grew.
Mhm.
They're in charge of invasive species management now, for example, tracking all kinds of fish hatcheries, another
Right.
great example. So as that scope grew, the funding model did not.
Okay.
And DNR has gone to state lawmakers and said, we need to raise these license fees. But as that question is coming up, other people are saying, wait a minute. Why should hunters and anglers be the only ones who are bearing this burden when there are so many other things under this umbrella now?
So I think in the story, if I'm remembering this correctly, it was like 4.5% of people in this country, right?
North America.
In North America hunt.
Right.
So 4.5% of the population, 15% of the population fish. So to ask that population to increasingly take on the burden of, say, something like managing invasive species, which affects everyone,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
is not fair.
And even if those folks said, sure, charge us, let's do this, it would still not be enough.
Okay. So it's not just a Michigan problem. What are some of the other states doing to combat this?
We looked at a couple of models. Ellie's story talks about Minnesota a little bit. It talks about Missouri in some depth. And Missouri did something really interesting. They decided that every member, every citizen of Missouri, every resident of Missouri was going to pay a little bit of money to help with conservation efforts. So they take a little chunk out of sales tax.
Oh.
It's about a penny of sales tax for every $8 spent.
Oh.
So it's pretty minuscule.
Yeah.
But it has raised more than twice the amount of money that DNR is able to raise from hunting and fishing licenses. We're talking in Missouri about $170 million just from that effort.
Yeah.
And it has been pretty successful, they say, for them.
So what happens, if we don't find a funding model that works?
Yeah.
All right. And it's not just, as we know, the people who fish and the people who hunt who are going to be affected. What happens to
Right.
the DNR?
This is the question we love in journalism. Why should we care?
Why should we care?
Right. So the DNR, obviously, hunters, anglers care about how those resources are managed and stewarded and protected. But also we're talking about fish hatcheries. We're talking about invasive species. We're talking about all kinds of things that affect our natural world. And when we live in a place like where we live here in
Yes.
northern Michigan, we're getting into the territory where we're talking about when you go to the lakeshore, is it going to be overrun with a plant that shouldn't be there? Is that favorite bird you like still going to be able to nest here because the management of the wildlife and the natural resources around it have been okay? So this is something that affects not just people who do these particular activities. It affects all of us who live in this place and value this place, including, I would say restaurant owners who need people to come into their restaurant because they've decided to come to such a beautiful place on vacation.
So it cuts across all of the landscape.
Absolutely.
Period.
Yeah. And I think, I was reading your story, which is such a great story in IPR, but you can obviously, I think there's been some discussion in Michigan about increasing the licensing, fees for hunting and fishing, which to me struck me as, because just from someone who's covered a lot of different kinds of budgets, is you have a dwindling demographic of hunters and fishers who are already sort of bearing the brunt of the cost. Then you're talking about increasing that fee on them even more. So sort of increasing their responsibility for everyone else, which has potentially the effect of putting up a financial barrier to hunting and fishing at some point, dwindling that population even further. So it seems like diminishing returns on a budget perspective.
Absolutely. At the same exact time that the state and other groups, nonprofits, are working very hard to attract new people into those kinds of outdoor activities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not good. Right? Can I just say that?
It's not good, but what's cool is that there are solutions, right? That we can look to a place like Missouri and say, okay, that's what you did. Will that work here?
Yeah.
And it will be interesting to see whether the debate that plays out is the same old should we or shouldn't we with this thing that's in front of us, or should we look elsewhere and think about this in a new way?
Yeah. Well said. Very great story. Kudos to Ellie on that one.
Yeah,
That was
absolutely.
really great. So I want to start with something kind of fun because we've all been in this gray winter that just seems to be going. I know you lived in Alaska, Ed.
Yeah.
So this winter is probably nothing in comparison.
I lived in like rainy, warm Alaska, which is a thing.
Yeah.
So this is the first good winter I felt in
Really?
a long time. Yeah.
Oh, look at that. Well, I always look to a sure sign that winter may finally be coming to an end when I start to see these concert announcements. There were some big concert announcements from two of our biggest concert venues this week. Now, Beth, you're going to tell us about both Interlochen and the Cherry Festival, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Ed obviously knows the Interlochen campus well, and I'm sure maybe sometimes can hear bands practicing or playing in the summer.
Sound checks.
Sound checks, yeah, for sure. So this is about the time of the year that Interlochen Center for the Arts starts doing their rollout. And both the Cherry Fest and Interlochen have kind of changed their models in recent years, where they used to just have like everything came out all at once and you were waiting for that big like concert announcement day. But now it's kind of fun because it's like sprinkling little announcements up until the summer.
Little bits of hope.
Just little bits of like, oh, and also maybe it's financially easier for people to pace out their ticket buying if it's spread out over a couple months. But so Interlochen has started to announce some of its upcoming acts. So the first 3 concerts for the summer season are Straight No Chaser, which you and I love our 90s music. This is an a cappella 90s cover group, super popular on YouTube. They're doing a tour, bringing some O-Town, which is a real 90s throwback. Ed, any O-Town? Like, does that ring a bell at all?
So I was in the Spartan marching band at Michigan State. We played a bowl game, and it was like one of the like 8th tier bowl games. And we opened for, and I can't remember now, but I think we opened for O-Town.
Okay. I'm not even going to fact check because I don't want that to be wrong.
It was them or another boy band du jour. I don't know.
That's amazing. So they're coming. Earth, Wind, and Fire,
oh my
classic.
Gosh, yeah.
You've always been on like a wedding dance floor when Earth, Wind, and Fire comes on. And then after a 10-year hiatus, Allison Krauss and Union Station are coming back. So a lot of folks love that bluegrass group. All of those, shows are on the Interlochen website, and there's more coming, I know, on Monday. I've seen a little sneak preview. I can't say what they are, but there's some more acts coming.
How dare you dangle that carrot?
Just a little. And then, some of these shows are going on sale today when the show airs, so check those out for sure. And then on the Cherry Festival front, kind of going back to our area as millennials too, there's a rock show that they just announced with Hinder, Pop Evil, and Buck Cherry.
Oh my gosh.
On July 3rd at the Cherry Festival.
All right, I have to share. So back in the day when I was doing morning radio on a shock jock alternative rock station, all right, we were like bringing in all these people to Streeter's Ground Zero. I don't know if you remember that entertainment center. That was a big concert venue here, and I introduced several of those bands a few times. And let me just tell you, rock and roll can be a little bit ugly up close. I was like coming on, and I was just like, How did I get here?
It can be a little chaotic. And this rock show is in addition to some that Cherry Festival had already announced. So I know we're all Weird Al fans.
Yeah.
Weird Al's coming with his huge summer tour this year. T.I. and then Tyler Hubbard. So there's already some acts up there. And again, that rock show for the Cherry Festival going on sale today, just like some of the Interlochen shows.
Very cool. I have to mention too that there's a show that's coming to Kuwaitan in St. Ignace, so not necessarily in our area, but just over the bridge, and it's Bare Naked Ladies, Sugar Ray, and Fastball.
Wow.
One show, 3 amazing acts, the most celebrated alternative rock band of all time, Bare Naked Ladies, BNL for the true fans. And I'm obsessed with this, so tickets are going on sale today as well.
BNL was the first big concert I ever went to.
Really?
In East Lansing, and I didn't know they did this, but in $1 Million when they, when they sing Kraft Dinner, just millions of dry macaroni noodles flew out of boxes people had snuck in, and we were all covered. I didn't know that was a thing.
Wait, I didn't know that was a thing.
Maybe it's not a thing anymore.
That's amazing. Also, I think Christal and I have a Pavlovian response to Bare Naked Ladies because for years when I did her radio show, which kind of helped inspire us to do this podcast, 1 week was the theme song because I would come on at the end of the week. And now when I hear that in a grocery store, I'm like, oh no, we're going to be on. We're going to I still have that response to it.
When I hear it, I'm like, is Beth going to call in?
Right. That'll be a good one.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. And I do have to ask you one thing that you're looking forward to this weekend or next week. I'm going to start. My husband and I are going on a little, Valentine's weekend getaway. We're going to Northport, and we might be checking out the Yeti Fest tomorrow at Sutton's Bay, which would be a lot of fun. I've never seen a Yeti. I'd like to see one. It's on my list.
Yes, I think that you can do that.
How about you, Beth? What are you doing?
Well, I mean, kind of speaking of Yeti Fest and Sutton's Bay, I volunteer for the Bay Theater. I love the Bay Theater nonprofit, great local arts house theater. And speaking of concerts, they just announced their Spring Live at the Bay series. So they're starting to do live events and concerts at the Bay, which has been really cool. But the new spring season kicks off Saturday, tomorrow, with Doc Probst and the Riptide, which if you like Jimmy Buffett music, this is we have lays, we've got beach balls you can hit around the theater. There's going to be margaritas. It's going to be island music. So if you just want to get out of the snow and have a fun island theme, that's going to be happening Saturday night at the Bay.
Sounds fun. How about you, Ed?
I'm a volunteer at Old Town Playhouse, and I am not in this, but I'm looking forward to seeing this. The Addams Family musical opens next weekend. It's a great cast. There are actually 2 casts. One's called the Creepy Cast. One's called the Kooky Cast. So you can see the show twice.
They're creepy and they're
kooky.
Got it.
And it should be a lot of fun.
Oh, that sounds great.
So great. Very exciting. Thanks to our guest journalist, Beth Milligan, head writer for the Ticker, and Ed Ronco, news director for Interlochen Public Radio. We'll be back next week. Beth and I will be back with a special guest journalist. Jakob Wheeler is joining us from Glen Arbor Sun next week. Excited to have him. And you can find out more about the show at christalfrost.com. You can follow us on social media. Hey, we're even on TikTok for now.
Oh,
I know. That's crazy. I didn't know how to do it. I was like, I don't know how to do this. I had to old lady Google how to do TikTok.
As long as you don't call it the TikTok.
The TikTok. Remember the Facebook too? That was the thing. You can subscribe to Currently with Christal Frost wherever you get your podcasts. You can even watch the full show on YouTube and on Facebook. I want to say big thanks to our lead supporter, Golden Fowler Home Furnishings, located on South Garfield Avenue in Traverse City. Home fashion elevated. Support also comes from West Shore Bank. When you choose West Shore Bank, you're not just choosing a bank. You're choosing a partner committed to the well-being of our community, and you can visit them on 8th Street. And you can also thank the Coin Slot, the bar in Traverse City that is not just a bar. It's an arcade. And speaking of the Coin Slot, Ed, do you pinball?
Not for years.
Really?
But I tried a little just recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So would you like to play some pinball right now?
Let's do it.
Okay.
And I'm always down for pinball.
She's always down for some pinball. We like to decompress after a long news day with a little bit of pinball. Let's do it. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week here on Currently.
My question is, what did we ever do to Mars? Yeah, where did this beat begin?
Ed asked the hard question. I never thought to dig into the beat of why are they here? What is the fear?